Paris, November 13, 2022. The first time I entered the Louvre, I was only 7 years old. My mother held my hand as we walked through the immense galleries full of tourists. I remember the echo of footsteps on the marble halls and the muffled sound of voices, like a constant murmur spreading through the corridors. The eyes of hundreds of paintings followed us from side to side, but even with all that grandeur, there was something uncomfortable in the air, something I could never explain. Now, as an assistant curator of the museum, those childhood sensations haunted me with even greater intensity. In recent months, strange occurrences began to unfold in the depths of the museum, in the areas the public never sees. What started as simple artifact breakages, lights flickering without any apparent reason, and sounds that seemed to come from the foundations, quickly turned into something much more disturbing. One night, I was urgently called to the basement, where we stored some of the oldest and most valuable pieces, waiting for future exhibitions. The security guard was agitated, almost breathless, as if he had run a marathon. He was speaking quickly, his words stumbling over each other. "I saw something, sir. Down there, in the oldest chambers. Something that shouldn't be there." I frowned, more bothered than scared at that moment. The Louvre had security guards in every corner and cameras monitoring practically every area. How could anyone have gotten into the basement undetected? "What exactly did you see?" I asked, trying to stay calm. The man came closer and his eyes, wide with fear, carried an uncontrollable desperation. "I don't know. I can't explain. It was big, much bigger than any person, and it didn't seem human." I laughed nervously, thinking he had seen some animal sneaking through the underground tunnels. Rats, perhaps. But when I saw that he wasn't smiling back, my stomach tightened. I decided to investigate on my own. The catacombs beneath the Louvre are like a labyrinth. Not everyone knows that the museum is built on ancient tunnels dating back to the Middle Ages. Some parts were used as dungeons during the reign of Philip Augustus, and over the centuries, they were modified, expanded, and eventually forgotten. It was easy to get lost down there, where the walls were damp and the smell of mold permeated the air. Walking through those passages always gave me a feeling of claustrophobia, as if the walls were slowly closing in around me. When I reached the end of the corridor, in the area the guard had mentioned, I felt the weight of the darkness intensify. The ceiling lights flickered like candles about to go out. I opened a small metal door that led into a larger room, a forgotten chamber where ancient artifacts were stored. The moment my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something that made me freeze in place. In the farthest corner of the room, a shadow moved. It wasn't a rat, nor a human being. The creature was huge, almost the size of a horse, but it moved with an unnatural agility. Its skin, or whatever it was, seemed to glisten with a viscous moisture, and its eyes, red and soulless, shone in the gloom. I couldn't make out the exact shape of its body, as the darkness wrapped around its edges like a dense fog. But the smell was the most disturbing thing of all, the stench of rotting flesh, of something that had decayed for far too long in the depths of the earth. I should have run at that moment. My body begged me to, but my mind was paralyzed. I stood there, watching the creature as it crept closer, its heavy breathing filling the air with a wet, dragging sound. Suddenly, something made a loud noise behind me, an ancient artifact falling from a shelf, and it broke the trance I was in. I ran, my footsteps echoing off the narrow walls as the feeling of being chased consumed me. When I finally reached the surface, panting and with my heart pounding wildly, I decided not to tell anyone. Who would believe me? The creature I had seen, or imagined seeing, was beyond comprehension. However, the constant fear that had settled in me since that moment was real. Every time I descended into the museum's underground areas, I felt like I was being watched. Something in the shadows, something ancient, was awake. In the following weeks, other reports began to emerge among the staff. At first, they were just murmurs, whispered conversations during breakfast or breaks, but soon the fear spread. Night guards quit their jobs. Some claimed to have heard voices whispering in languages they didn't recognize. while others swore they had seen strange figures passing through security cameras, only to disappear when investigated. Even some visitors mentioned feeling a strange presence as they walked through the older galleries. That's when I decided to investigate further. During my research, I discovered something terrifying in the Louvre's historical archives. Apparently, during the museum's original construction in the 12th century, workers reported strange accidents. People mysteriously disappeared into the tunnels while working on the foundations. Reports spoke of bizarre sounds coming from deeper caves, sounds resembling muffled screams or howls from something inhuman. Most of these accounts were dismissed as urban legends, but now, something about them seemed horribly real. Based on these documents, I decided to explore an area of the basement that had been sealed off for centuries. It was a part so ancient that few knew of its existence. I armed myself with a flashlight, a camera, and a knife. I didn't know what I might encounter, but I wanted to be prepared. I descended the stone steps leading to the museum's most forgotten section, an area not even marked on official maps. The smell of dampness and decay was stronger here, and the air felt almost dense, as if the environment resisted my presence. After more than an hour of walking through the narrow, damp passages, I found what appeared to be a ritualistic chamber. In the center of it, there was a stone altar covered with inscriptions I didn't recognize. On the altar, there were dark, dried stains that looked like blood. But the most disturbing thing of all was the symbols carved into the walls. Grotesque figures twisted in agony, as if they were being consumed by something. Scattered across the floor were the remains of bones, broken and gnawed. Suddenly, I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the depths of the chamber. My legs wavered, and the flashlight in my hand began to tremble. I knew that it was here, the creature that had haunted the museum for centuries, the beast that fed the legends. The growl grew louder, and in a fit of pure terror, I began to run, but it was too late. I felt a presence behind me, a shadow that moved too fast for something its size. I heard the sound of claws scraping against the stone, and felt a wave of repulsive heat as something passed close enough to almost touch me. My lungs burned, and my legs were about to give out, but by some miracle, I managed to reach the stairs and climb toward the surface. When I finally reached the main floor, I fell to my knees, unable to breathe, fear still coursing through my veins. Since that night, I haven't gone down to the Louvre's basement again. But I know the creature is still down there, lurking in the shadows, feeding on something ancient, something forgotten by men, but never truly dead. The Louvre hides many secrets, but none as terrifying as the beast. And now, every time I look at the museum's walls, I feel it watching back, waiting for the right moment to emerge. When that moment comes, no gallery, painting, or civilization will be able to contain it. The fear I felt that night hasn't left me. No matter how much I try to forget, the memories of that growl, of that dark and oppressive presence, haunt my dreams. Every time I lay down, I can once again smell the creature's rotten stench, hear the sound of its claws scraping against stone, and worst of all, see its eyes. Those red eyes that seem to lock onto my soul, as if they wanted to tear it apart from the inside out. In the following weeks, I tried to carry on with my work as usual. Each day at the Louvre felt like a desperate attempt to cling to normality, to forget that a monstrous beast inhabited the depths of the museum. But it was impossible. The corridors, once familiar and welcoming, now seemed threatening, with shadows dancing on the walls, as if something was always lurking. The murmurs among the staff intensified. Some spoke of an ancient curse, of spirits wandering the halls, trapped there by atrocities that had happened centuries ago. Others were convinced it was the work of the supernatural, but no one, except me, knew the truth. The real trouble began when a tourist disappeared. It was a morning like any other. The Louvre buzzed with people, thousands of visitors walking through the galleries, admiring masterpieces, enchanted by the art and history housed within. At first, no one noticed. With so many visitors, losing track of one or two wasn't uncommon. But by the afternoon, when security checked the cameras, something inexplicable caught their attention. The footage showed a man walking alone near the older galleries. He seemed distracted, admiring the sculptures and paintings around him. Then suddenly the image began to glitch. Heavy interference took over the screen, as if something were tampering with the circuits. When the image returned to normal, the man was gone. There was no sign of him, no movement to explain what had happened. He had simply vanished. A search was organized, but nothing was found. No clues, no trace. It was as if he had evaporated into thin air. Security was baffled, and the authorities were called. In the following days, rumors started to circulate among the staff. Some believed the tourist had left without being seen. Others thought he might have gotten lost in the museum's underground. But I knew the truth was far worse. I spent sleepless nights going through historical records, desperate to find some explanation for what was happening. That's when I discovered something even more disturbing. In an old diary from a 17th century architect responsible for some of the Louvre's renovations, I found mentions of La Bête. The creature had been mentioned before, not as a legend, but as a macabre reality. The architect, Pierre Delacroix, described an incident during the construction of one of the underground tunnels. Workers disappeared, just like the tourist. Strong men, accustomed to hard life, simply vanished into the shadows. When they tried to dig deeper, they found an ancient chamber, predating the museum itself, a cave that, according to him, smelled of death and was infested with something not of this world. Delacroix reported that after losing more men, they decided to seal the cave with a massive stone wall. The location was forgotten, buried underground, far from public eyes, like a wound that should never be reopened. But apparently, time had been unforgiving to the museum's foundations. Something, or someone, must have accidentally broken through that barrier, unleashing the creature that now roamed the depths. Gradually, the disappearances began to increase. First, it was the tourist, then one of the museum's security guards. He was on night patrol, and the same pattern occurred. Interference on the cameras, strange noises on the recordings, and then nothing. No trace, no body. As if the beast was feeding, growing in power with every lost soul. The atmosphere at the Louvre changed dramatically. The museum, once a symbol of culture and art, began to transform into a place filled with fear and anxiety. The number of visitors began to drop dramatically as rumors of disappearances and unexplained phenomena spread, and I, more than anyone, knew I was losing the battle against the creature. It was then that I decided I couldn't continue like this. I had to face it, not just for my sanity, but for everyone else still at risk. If that thing remained loose, it would continue devouring lives until no one was left. And although fear gnawed at my insides, I knew I couldn't run. I prepared for days, studying every detail of the tunnels, the chambers, and Delacroix's account. I brought with me a backpack full of flashlights, ropes, a map of the catacombs, and something I considered essential: coarse salt and an old crucifix I had found in the museum's archives. I didn't know if it was superstition or desperation, but anything that could give me a chance against the creature was welcome. I descended into the tunnels again on a cold and silent night, when the museum was closed. Each step echoed sinisterly against the stone walls, and the smell of mold and decay seemed stronger than ever. My hands trembled slightly, and the sound of my own heavy breathing was the only thing breaking the oppressive silence. As I walked through the narrow passages, I tried to stay calm, but the fear that the creature was waiting, just watching, suffocated me. When I finally reached the old sealed chamber, I felt an inexplicable cold, as if the air was being sucked out by some invisible force. The wall that should have contained the creature was partially broken, with displaced stones and moss covering the cracks. Up close, the smell was unbearable, as if death had lived there for centuries. I placed my flashlight on the ground and began exploring the chamber carefully. It was larger than I expected, and the symbols on the walls, more detailed, were even more disturbing up close. Carvings of human figures twisted in agony, as if they were being consumed by something far more powerful. In the center, a crack in the floor exhaled a thin gray smoke, and then I heard it. The growl, deeper this time, as if it came from the bowels of the earth. I turned, and there it was, slowly emerging from the shadows. The creature I had feared for so long. Its red eyes locked onto mine, and I realized that running was no longer an option. It wanted me. It wanted my soul, just like the others it had devoured. My body froze, but I knew I couldn't hesitate. With a courage I didn't know I had, I raised the crucifix toward the beast, my voice trembling as I recited words I could barely remember. The creature hesitated for a brief moment, but then lunged with terrifying speed. Its claws slashed through the air in front of me, and I barely managed to dodge. I fell to the ground hard, and the crucifix rolled away. I was at its mercy. The beast approached, its stench almost making me vomit, and its eyes now gleamed with a cruel pleasure. But then, something happened. The gray smoke that exhaled from the crack began to stir, and before the creature could strike me, the chamber itself seemed to react. The walls trembled, and a high-pitched, unearthly scream echoed through the space. The creature stopped, recoiling as if being repelled by an invisible force. I seized the moment and, with what little strength I had left, crawled out of the chamber, leaving the flashlight behind. When I finally returned to the surface, the night was still cold, and Paris seemed strangely silent. Behind me, deep in the Louvre, I knew the battle wasn't over. The silence I found upon emerging from the depths of the Louvre was almost deafening. Paris, the city that never sleeps, seemed trapped in an unnatural calm that night. The sky was shrouded in heavy clouds, as if nature itself sensed the evil lurking beneath the earth. I sat on the stone steps of the museum entrance, gasping for air, my body still trembling from the confrontation. Every muscle in my body ached, but my mind was even worse, overwhelmed by the certainty that I had faced something beyond human comprehension. The creature was still down there, and I had escaped by sheer luck. But one thing was clear: it wouldn't stay away for long. The ancient chamber, which had seemed to revolt against the beast itself, had given me a small advantage, a moment to breathe. I needed to find out more. I had to understand what was in that smoke, in those ancient inscriptions, and more importantly, I had to find a way to stop it, once and for all. Going home that night was torture. Every shadow seemed to watch me. Every stranger's footsteps on the street made me jump. And even inside my small apartment, surrounded by the city's lights, I felt that the presence was still with me, as if its influence extended beyond the museum's foundations. I couldn't sleep. My eyes were fixed on the ceiling, my heart racing with every little noise in the building. Something deep inside me told me that it wasn't over, that the creature, even contained for now, was waiting for its moment to hunt again. The next morning, still exhausted and dazed, I returned to the Louvre. The museum was as crowded as ever, but now I saw the corridors through different eyes. Those galleries, once filled with culture and history, now seemed to conceal something dark, something the visitors could never imagine. It was hard to focus on work, but I had to keep up appearances. I couldn't raise suspicions. I couldn't drive people away from the museum, even though my instinct was to shout for everyone to leave that cursed place. That afternoon, I found something that changed everything. While digging through more old archives in the museum's back rooms, I discovered a collection of diaries written by a 19th century curator, Marguerite Lenoir. The texts were dusty, stored in a locked drawer. From what I gathered, Marguerite was a researcher obsessed with the catacombs beneath the Louvre. What I began reading in her accounts chilled me to the bone. She spoke of the origins of the museum before it was the Louvre, and mentioned the ancient medieval castle built by Philip Augustus, which had served as a fortress. However, Marguerite believed the castle had been erected on something much older, a pagan temple where dark rituals had been performed. The inhabitants of the time worshipped an entity they called Bête des Abîmes, the beast of the abyss. According to her writings, this entity wasn't just a physical creature, but a primordial evil force, something that existed long before humans and fed on souls. As I read Marguerite's notes, I realized that she, too, had descended into the catacombs in search of answers. In her last diary entry, the curator reported discovering the chamber I had found, the same one with grotesque symbols and the sacrificial altar. She believed that those who worshipped the beast had tried to imprison it in the earth's depths with ancient magic, but that the seal had been weakening over the centuries. Her final account was particularly disturbing. I heard its whispers. It wants to be freed. Marguerite disappeared shortly after writing those words. I swallowed hard, feeling my body weighed down by exhaustion and fear. The creature I saw wasn't just a monster. It was a manifestation of something much larger, something that existed to consume and destroy. I knew that if I didn't find a way to restore the seal or destroy it for good, the Louvre would become a hunting ground. And not just the museum. If the beast escaped, all of Paris would be in danger. The following nights were a blur of desperation. I returned to the chamber several times, always at night, trying to decipher the symbols, studying the fragments of Marguerite's diaries. The tension was eating away at my nerves, and the creature remained present in the depths, like a shadow always lurking. I knew time was running out. During one of these visits, I noticed something strange in the crack where the smoke exhaled. There were new marks, as if enormous claws had scratched the stone floor. The creature was more active, trying to emerge. It was during one of these incursions that I found what might be the key to stopping the beast. Marguerite had mentioned in her diary a lost artifact, a dagger forged with sacred symbols that, according to legend, had been used in the rituals to seal the creature. She believed the dagger was still hidden in the catacombs, but she never found it. I had no choice but to try. I spent days searching for any clue about the artifact's whereabouts. I combed through records, old maps of the foundations, and even spoke with archaeologists who had worked on excavations at the Louvre. That's how I discovered a secret gallery that had been sealed off centuries ago for safety reasons. No modern record mentioned it, but the old documents referred to it as a repository of profane objects. On a cold, rainy night, I descended once again into the basement, this time with a plan. Using an old map, I found a forgotten entrance, covered by debris. Getting through it was a challenge. The stones and soil were heavy and damp, and the corridor was narrow, almost claustrophobic. When I finally reached the gallery, the air was even heavier and more oppressive. I could feel I was close to the truth, and also close to the creature. In the center of the room, covered in dust and cobwebs, I found the dagger. It was an ancient piece, with a black metal blade encrusted with inscriptions that glowed faintly under the light of my flashlight. Holding it in my hands was like grasping a live flame. I could feel the power emanating from it. But at the same time, I heard the sound I feared most. The creature was there. It emerged from the gallery's shadows, its gigantic and deformed body, more horrifying than before. Its red eyes glowed like embers, and a growl reverberated through the walls as if the earth itself were trembling in fear. I knew this was the final confrontation. There was nowhere to run, no time to hesitate. With the dagger in hand, I walked toward the beast, my heart racing and my mind whirling with terror. The creature advanced, its heavy steps shaking the ground. When it was only a few meters from me, I raised the dagger and, in a last act of desperation, drove it into the gallery floor, right in the center of the sacred symbols covering the ground. The effect was immediate. The entire chamber began to shake violently. The walls cracked, and a cold wind, coming from within the earth itself, enveloped everything. The creature let out a deafening scream, a sound that seemed to echo through the depths of existence. Its form began to contort, as if it were being torn apart from the inside. The shadows around it dissipated, and the beast, that entity that had devoured souls for centuries, began to be pulled back into the crack in the floor, into the abyss from which it should never have emerged. I threw myself to the ground, trying to shield myself from the falling debris around me. The creature's scream turned into a distant howl until finally, the silence returned. The crack in the floor closed and the air stopped vibrating. The beast of the Louvre was sealed once again. When I emerged from the catacombs for the last time, Paris seemed the same, but for me the world had changed. The creature, once again sealed, would remain dormant, perhaps for centuries. The Louvre would continue to be the majestic, world-renowned museum it always was, but I knew the truth. Behind its walls and beneath its foundations, something terrible still waited. And as much as I wanted to forget, I knew I never could. The beast was trapped, but never completely destroyed. Upon returning to the surface, I found myself facing a Paris that, at first glance, seemed unchanged. The Eiffel Tower's lights twinkled in the distance. The cobbled streets were wet from the rain that had fallen during the night, and tourists still strolled carelessly through the avenues, unaware of the terror lurking beneath their feet. For them, the Louvre was just another tourist attraction, a symbol of culture and history. But for me, that museum carried a much darker burden, and now, I too carried that weight. I'd like to say that with the creature's imprisonment, everything returned to normal. That the museum carried on without further incident, that the staff stopped hearing whispers or feeling presences in the empty corridors. But that would be a lie. Something changed in me after that night. As much as the beast was sealed, there was still the constant feeling that somehow it remained connected to me. The first time I noticed this was a few weeks later, when I returned to the Louvre one morning. Everything seemed normal at first glance. The murmur of visitors, the sound of footsteps echoing through the marble halls, the security guards discreetly watching over the artworks. But something felt wrong. The smell, a subtle odor of dampness, like a cold breeze blowing from within the museum's foundations. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks, still traumatized by the events I had witnessed. But day after day, that smell worsened. That night, when I was at home, I felt something different, a heaviness in the air. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. The walls of my apartment, which had once given me a sense of security, now seemed to close in around me. I felt like I was being watched, but there was no one there, at least not visibly. That's when I heard it, the same low growl, almost a whisper, coming from the shadows of the room. My heart raced, and I felt as if I'd been transported back to the catacombs beneath the Louvre. But this time, I was at home, far from the museum. Immediately, my instinct was to deny what was happening. I convinced myself it was just a product of my imagination, that the trauma of recent events was affecting me, that there was no way the creature, trapped back in the museum's depths, could have somehow followed me here. I tried to return to my routine, to ignore the signs that something was wrong, but the nights brought no rest. The growl persisted, always at the edge of my hearing, as if it were hiding in the shadows of my own room. Increasingly, that smell of rot lingered in the air. The beast somehow was still with me. It was on one of these nights that I woke from a nightmare so real, it felt more like a vision. I was back in the catacombs, but the chamber was different. The walls pulsed as if they were alive, covered in a dark, viscous substance that slowly dripped down to the floor. In the center, where I had driven the dagger, the ground was cracked, and from the open fissure, a thick, black smoke rose, and, in the depths of that abyss, the creature's red eyes gleamed, fixed on me. It wasn't trapped. It never was. Somehow, it had marked me. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of my own ragged breathing filling the silence. But then I realized I wasn't alone in the room. In the gloom, a figure moved. For a brief moment, I saw the deformed, towering shadow crouched in the corner of the room. Its low growl reverberated off the walls, but when I desperately reached for the light switch, the figure disappeared. I stayed still for long minutes, trying to convince myself it was just the effect of the nightmare. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day I went to the museum in search of answers. I returned to the archives, this time looking for information not just about the beast, but about Marguerite Lenoir herself. During my research, I discovered that, before she disappeared, Marguerite had also reported disturbing experiences outside the museum. She believed that by confronting the creature in the depths, she had created a bond with it. Something about the entity's power transcended the physical space of the catacombs. Its influence extended beyond the Louvre's walls. In Marguerite's diaries, I found mentions of ancient rituals, darker than those that initially sealed the creature. A group of monks, supposedly living in the region even before Paris was founded, were dedicated to containing evil entities. They believed these beings could infect the living, like a spiritual disease, leading to madness and slow death. And if someone made direct contact with such entities, as I had done, they would be irrevocably linked to them. The revelation devastated me. With each new detail I uncovered, it became clear that I was the next victim. The creature didn't just want to consume souls in the Louvre, it was hunting me. It was using me as a connection to the world of the living. The museum, once its only domain, had now expanded, and I was the portal. I tried everything to protect myself. I visited occult specialists, sought out priests and mediums, people who might know how to break this cursed bond. Some gave me protective charms, others offered prayers, but nothing seemed to work. Deep down, I knew the creature was more powerful than any modern magic. Its power was ancient, from a time before men, before religions. The following weeks spiraled into a descent of terror. It didn't matter where I was, at the museum, at home, or even in the midst of crowds on the streets, I always felt its presence, like a constant shadow. It didn't need to physically attack me. Its goal was more insidious. It was corroding my sanity, slowly. Every time I closed my eyes, its whispers became louder. Every time I looked into the shadows, I was certain its red eyes were watching me. Finally, on the last night before I made a drastic decision, I had a dream, or perhaps a vision, in which Marguerite Lenoir appeared to me. Her face, once beautiful and young, was distorted, as if it had been touched by the creature itself. But her eyes were still human, and they looked at me with a kind of dark compassion. She didn't speak directly to me, but her gestures were clear. She showed me a path, a place beyond the catacombs, where an even deeper chamber existed. In this chamber, she said, I would find the key to breaking the bond with the creature, but the price would be high. When I awoke, I knew what I had to do. I returned to the Louvre one last time, descending deeper than ever before. Guided by the map in my mind, by the memories of the dream, I passed through passages that seemed forgotten by time itself. The air there was suffocating, heavy, and the darkness felt alive. When I finally reached the chamber Marguerite had mentioned, I saw what I feared. A second altar, identical to the first, but with one crucial difference. In the center, there was a deep well from which a terrible cold emanated. I knew what I had to do. The only way to break the bond with the creature was by sacrificing something. Not an object or a simple ritual, but my own life. The entity fed on souls, and by offering mine, I would imprison it, for good. I took the dagger I had kept since our last battle, and with trembling hands, I walked to the altar. The shadows around me began to stir, and I knew the beast was close. Its growl echoed through the corridors, but this time, I didn't run. I knelt before the altar, feeling the cold dagger against my skin, and murmured the words I had read in Marguerite's diaries. The creature emerged from the darkness, its monstrous form filling the chamber. Its eyes glowed, and a twisted smile seemed to form on its horrendous face. It knew what I was doing, and it didn't try to stop me. After all, I was offering myself willingly. With one last breath, I drove the dagger into my chest. Everything went dark. When I woke up, the chamber was empty. The beast had finally been sealed. I was still alive, but something inside me had died that night. I had paid the price. The creature would no longer hunt me, but I knew that, in some way, a part of it would remain with me forever. The Louvre would stand tall, majestic, and imposing. People would continue to visit its galleries, admire its masterpieces, never knowing the horror that lurked beneath its depths. But I knew. And every time I walked through the galleries, I still felt the slight brush of a lurking shadow.